Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Moffitt, and welcome to this edition of the Washington Brief. Dr. Michael Jenkins is chairman of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this program. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, which owns the Times News organization, and has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan over the years that have met with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. Also, as president of the nonprofit NGO Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry. Welcome to our audience, which is throughout America and throughout the whole world. Today's program is focused on, is it too late to manage China's ambitions? It's my honor to welcome our distinguished panel led by Ambassador Christopher Hill, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea and currently the Charles W. Ball Distinguished Adjunct Professor for International Affairs in the Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs. Also on the panel is Ambassador Joseph Trani, the former Special Envoy to the six-party talks and negotiations with North Korea and the six parties and Director of the National Counterproliferation Center. He was Associate Director of National Intelligence and Mission Manager for North Korea. He's a veteran CIA person and leader and currently a professor at Missouri State University's Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. Also on our panel today is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, the Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Security Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Our special guest today is Dr. Michael Pillsbury, one of the world's leading China experts, a fluent speaker of Mandarin and author of the 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. The book discusses in detail for more than 40 years how the U.S. has played an indispensable role in helping the Chinese government build a booming economy, develop its scientific and military capabilities, and take its place on the world stage in the belief that China's rise will bring us cooperation, diplomacy, and free trade. But it may be that China's goal has been to supplant the United States as the world's dominant power and to do so by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Dr. Pillsbury, whose service in senior national security positions in the U.S. government goes back to the days of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. He's currently a senior fellow and director of Chinese strategy at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. I'd like to turn this over now to our moderator, Ambassador Christopher Hill. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins, and thank you very much for that really that great introduction of this program. I think the Washington Brief has covered a lot of subjects, mainly gathered around the issue of North Korea and what to do with North Korea. But I think today we're going to discuss a broader and perhaps even greater threat in the region, and that is the recent, and I say recent, but it's not so recent, Chinese performance in the international community, and the fact that the hoped for situation where China would kind of come into conformance with international norms is really not happening. And I think no one is better to talk about this than Michael Pillsbury. Well, history is not over yet, but certainly now, I think Dr. Pillsbury has the opportunity to say, hey, I was right and many of you were wrong. And so I think we'll explore this issue of whither China. And in looking at whither China, is China this kind of predatory state looking to kind of undermine our leadership in the world, not just our leadership, but an entire sort of, the world order as we know it. And of course, this brings up the question, can we work with China even in areas that we have thought in the past, such as North Korea's nuclear ambitions, that China had an interest in working with us? Dr. Pillsbury, as Dr. Jenkins laid out, is a person who is extremely well not only briefed, but also and not only read, but has also been one of the great authors on the China national security state. And we, I think, have come to an important juncture where actually there's a growing consensus about what China means to us. And an increasing consensus that there's really not a lot of areas where we can work with China in the current circumstance. So we are going to have to kind of hunker down and look for our own long march as we figure out how to deal with this this extraordinary country, a country that represents thousands of years of civilization, and a country that represents well over 1 billion now in population. So I think what we'll do here is I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Pillsbury, perhaps to talk about some of his ideas and kind of framing terms to talk about this his new book. And by the way, it's not his only book. Dr. Pillsbury has written many others on this general subject. And then we'll kind of turn to Ambassador Joe Trani, who is no stranger to Chinese issues, having served in China and served as someone in the North Korean equation, and also to ask Alex Mansourov to talk about his perspective on where we go with China and what type of situation we and our people can expect in the coming years. So, Dr. Pillsbury, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and you can talk about China. Take some credit, really, for the fact that many of your ideas are becoming quite not only mainstream, but consensus ideas, and perhaps give us a glimpse of where you see this all going.
Thank you, Chris. It might be most helpful to you and the panel if I describe two different debates that I think are going on and for many years to come. And these debates will give us a clue as to whether or not we can manage what I call a rising China and China's ambitions. The first set of debates is in Beijing. And all three of my books have focused a lot on these debates in Beijing. It's very flattering to me that all three books have been translated into Chinese and published in China, including the 100-Year Marathon. But in each case, there's a preface that explains the book is wrong or that I have prejudices against China, but all cadres of the Communist Party must still read this book. So the debate in Beijing that I first saw more than 20 years ago is very strange for Americans to even hear the subject. The debate is, how fast will America decline and be one of many 4 or 5 powers in the world? And how fast will China rise? So for an entire book of 350 pages on this subject of this one debate that came out in 2000, I cited quotations, 600 quotations from 200 authors who I had visited in Beijing to get their views. And the thing about going around in China, as everybody sort of knows who's done it, if you avoid sensitive topics, you can actually learn a great deal from interacting with Chinese scholars, Chinese think tanks, even sometimes with Chinese officials. And one of my favorite devices was to have with me, when I would be meeting scholar A, I'd have books in my briefcase written by scholars B, C, and D. And I'd pull them out and I'd say, what do you think of this book? And people perhaps have the same emotions and the same pride and envy all over the world. So sometimes an author would say, that book is really stupid. My book, it says this, and I'm right. And then I would learn more about that debate. But what I learned in the 2000 book was that I'd call the hawks. They were saying China will surpass America within about 5 years. So by 2005, we will have a multipolar world in which China is the first among 5 or 6 others. That group tended to be PLA generals. Our old friend Xiong Guangkai indicated his association with this group. But the other group was quite different. One of the authors there, a gentleman named Yang Dazhou at the Xinhua news agency, fluent in English, served in many posts overseas for Xinhua. His view was America will be the dominant superpower, the only superpower for 50 years, at least 50 years. And he had a whole book outlining the indicators that he was following. So as I went around Beijing and to some degree in Shanghai and elsewhere, it was fairly easy to get people to talk about the indicators of which of these two views was more likely to develop and the dissenting voices. In that process, I stumbled on a concept that I'd only heard vaguely expressed called Zhonghe Guoli, comprehensive national power. And it turned out that the Chinese have a view that they trace back to Mencius and others 2,500 years ago, that before you make any kind of geopolitical move, know what the balance of power is. And you think, well, that's common sense. You know, everybody does that. Well, actually, everybody doesn't do it. Many people don't worry about the balance of power, or they think of it as purely military. So in the book 20 years ago about Chinese debates, I laid out 6 different teams and their mathematical scores for the growth rates of America, China, the other top 5 or 6 powers. It was quite fascinating to see how seriously they took out to the 2nd or 3rd decimal point which country was going to be ahead of which country. And now, of course, 20 years later, we have a better idea of who was right, who was wrong. So Chinese scholars over the last 5 years have been much more bullish about China. Some of them, I would say, are openly contemptuous about American power. Looking at all the various indicators, there's a case to be made that China is already ahead of us in some really significant areas. So that's debate number 1. Who's ahead in the balance of power? What are the trends? Where are we going over the long term? And the notion that in Beijing, there's not a single voice on this. So you can have foreign ministry people saying, you know, you Americans, there was a phrase called yi qiao duo qiang, one superpower and many great powers. So the foreign ministry may have one view that China should, and did, that China should be modest, should be cooperative, should be helpful to Chris Hill and Joe Trani in the 6 power talks. But at the same time, there could be another point of view, which I believe from 2000 to 2012 or so tended to be the minority view, that saw Chinese power as much greater and American decline is much steeper than the foreign ministry view. So now if we fast forward to 2015, 100-year marathon came out in 2015. There was a 2-year delay before they translated it, had a nice ceremony for me in Beijing at the National Defense University Press. And I noticed that the book was marked secret. Even though every word was translated correctly, a woman PLA colonel with a PhD from the Academy of Military Science, her name and photo are on the book jacket. She told me it took her almost 3 years to translate the book. I said, where's my royalties? If you want, 95 million party members to read this book, then that would be at least $1 for each copy. And I would donate this to a charity, here in Washington. And they said, you don't understand. Your book is not for sale. It's only for party members and colonels and above in the PLA. And I said, why? This, you translated the whole thing. And the answer was chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Chinese people are not ready for chapter 3. That is why the book is classified. I turned to chapter 3. It's all about how wonderful the US and China cooperated in the 70s and 80s. A lot of declassified documents, and God bless State, Defense, and CIA for declassifying and making this book a bestseller, frankly. because of all these documents about cooperation. And as I recall, Joe Trani's name was in there, but his title was redacted. So there are a lot of redactions in chapter 3, but the basic story is clear. The US DOD and Chinese PLA, the US intelligence community and their Chinese counterparts, not to mention other sectors, all had enormous cooperation that I would argue rivals or even exceeded our cooperation with the British, our special relationship. And therefore, I was deeply puzzled. The success story of US-China cooperation, why was it the most sensitive part of the book? And the two generals at the ceremony, both of whom had written prefaces, by the way, to the book, Liu Yazhou and Dai Xu, they wrote prefaces saying Dr. Pillsbury made enormous contributions to US-China relations, but in recent years, he has lost his way. We hope he will return someday. So our notion that, and this is to some degree in Chris Hill's memoir, our notion that we were going to have ever increasing cooperation with China, which frankly I believed back in the 80s. I'm a reformed panda hugger. I believed in all this. I was actually in charge of some of the DOD decisions in the 80s under Reagan and Weinberger of which weapons we would sell to China. And we were pretty forward. We sold the Mark 46 torpedoes. Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, went over to personally make sure this deal was done. We had a series of 6 weapon systems that had to be approved by the US Congress, and it was approved, basically 99-1. So if you look back at the 80s, what you were justified in thinking was the Chinese are already quite friendly in the national security area. Things can only get better in the future. At the same time, in the 80s, their growth rate had not yet skyrocketed at 10% for 30 years. So China remaining militarily and economically much weaker than us, that was also a very legitimate view. If you were asking this very same question, how could we manage Chinese ambitions in 1985, it would be a laughable question. This is a poor country, it's going nowhere, and they're really friendly with us, in part because of the Soviet threat to them. So what the Chinese did like about chapter 3, which we had quite a long discussion about, was a set of declassified documents I got in the Nixon library and a complicated set of Chinese materials, in particular the memoir of one Chinese general who was the note taker for the 4 Marshals Committee back in 1969 that Chairman Mao set up. So what should we do? And the 4 Marshals came back saying we need to reach out to the Americans. And this was not a popular view. I would say nobody in our country believed that China had reached out to us in 69 to 71. Our story is the opposite. China was angry, isolated, under chaos, basically, in the Cultural Revolution. And the brilliant Nixon and even more brilliant Henry Kissinger saw this and reached out in a secret trip to open up China. And therefore, we were managing China. We were in charge of the relationship. We took the initiative. This is our story from our records. Until you look a little deeper, then you find out, and Dr. Kissinger confirmed this in his book on China in 2011, 2012, he and Nixon, he admits, turned down 5 initiatives from China to start the relationship. Now, that's not the conventional wisdom. But worse than that, Kissinger's 4 books, he had the monopoly on what happened in the meetings with Mao and Zhou Enlai. So for 25 years, he wrote 4 books. Nixon wrote his memoirs. They all said the same thing. We reached out to a poor, backward, angry, isolated China and helped them come in to the world. When you see the materials, however, that were declassified for this book, you find quite the opposite. You find it was the ping pong team invitation, which came from Mao himself, that triggered the opening. In the Nixon library today, you can open up these old boxes, take out the original documents of the Chinese reaching out to the Nixon White House. And then sometimes there'll be a box saying approve, disapprove, and it's checked disapprove. One of the most shocking documents I saw, in case you don't all know Alan Whiting, he's one of the stars of the China field from his time in INR in the 50s, actually, and on in the 60s. Alan Whiting wrote a famous top secret code word memo to Kissinger and Nixon saying there could be a Sino-Soviet war. Here's the deployments. Here's why I'm worried. Nixon did not, but Kissinger references this memo in one of his books, that it was a game changer to see what Alan Whiting had put together on the possible Soviet invasion scenario. But in fact, there's a document where Whiting writes to Kissinger, I understand Edgar Snow spent many hours with Chairman Mao at the October 1st, 1970 parade. This is highly unusual for the Chairman Mao and his team to spend so much time with an American. I like to fly to Geneva and debrief him, approve, disapprove, travel money, X amount. What box did Dr. Kissinger check, Chris and Joe? Disapprove.
Yeah.
Disapprove.
Yeah.
So in the various memoirs, they always cite this as, unfortunately, the Chinese thought that Edgar Snow was a CIA asset. Therefore, if they told him the message, he would relay it, but he didn't. He was really quite an anti-American living in Switzerland in protest. Yeah. The message, by the way, was Mao said to Snow, I want to see Nixon in Beijing. He's invited to come to China. So there's this series of historical puzzles I try to examine in 100-Year Marathon. How did we get here? And what was the Chinese debate? And what was the American debate? The Chinese debate had some very strong anti-American people. One of their slogans in 71 was, Nixon can never put down his butcher's knife and turn into a Buddha. This is only 4 characters. And if Jim Lilly were here, Joe, he would want us to say the 4 characters. So when there's a declassified document now where Mao turns to Nixon and says, some people did not want you to come to China, but don't worry about it. You know why Chairman Mao said that? Lin Biao and the top military leaders and some civilian leaders of China at that point were either dead or headed for life in prison. But it showed us at the time, wow, there's not a big consensus here on the opening to America. So let me leave the Chinese debates for further discussion. The other debate that's quite interesting is the American debate. And I mean inside our government, various officials writing various memos. And what is the story there that we need to understand to inform ourselves? What is it too late to manage China's ambitions? And here too, you find a really wide range of views inside the government. And one point of view has been, I would say, the most popular. And it's a kind of globalization worldview based in large part on faith of what has been happening really since the League of Nations. That if we want to outlaw war, we're going to have a Security Council. We're going to have be able to send troops. We have to have all major powers belong. Yes, we can have a veto, but basically we need to manage the world through the United Nations and consultations. And yes, there'll be some bilateral talks on the side. There'll be some multilateral organizations, but we must commit all major nations to prevent war to a structure like the UN Charter. So our view on that as a society has been something like, 70%, let's say, of Americans believe that. And that gives you your China policy. We need to do whatever we have to do to get China to join this framework. The problem is when China starts violating principles of what the Biden administration likes to call LIO, the Liberal International Order, then you have to fall back on, well, what can we do now? In theory, the Security Council would authorize the use of force to punish countries that violated the LIO. Oh, no, China's one of the five, not to mention possible support from Russia. So the Security Council so far cannot be put down as a factor that help us manage Chinese ambitions. They can use it. They can use our principal security architecture in the world, the UN Security Council, to block any action against them. So that is a negative factor on the idea of managing Chinese global ambitions. Now, there's a second debate that goes on, which is the nature of Chinese ambitions. And this is really vicious inside the China field. You've got a range of views. I took a stand in my book, which I really regret. I wish I'd been more wishy-washy and just said, all things are possible. China may be a meek little lamb. And on the other hand, they may be a wild man-eating tiger. I just don't know. But I took a stand based on a lot of Chinese documents and interviews that they clearly, one school of thought, in particular, Liu Mingfu's book, The China Dream, one school of thought was that we need to return China to the way things have been for about 2,500 years. And there's one power in the way of our doing that, the Americans. So they came up with an idea, and I think I know the author himself, this wonderful Chinese expression, 新兴大国关系, new model, in English, the closest translation, it's a little off, but the closest one, new model of great power relations. This was presented by Xi Jinping to President Obama at the Sunnylands Summit. And at first, Susan Rice, John Kerry, Vice President Biden, they said positive things about this. Sounds pretty good, because the way it was explained in the first round is the new model of great power relations means that the old power will not start a war with the rising new power. Well, that's common sense, right? That's like the UN Charter. Until you press a little deeper, well, what exactly would this war be all about? Well, and Xi Jinping himself said Thucydides' trap in 2012 before Graham Allison. And he talked about, during these transitions that we've studied in the world over the last 1,000 years or more, the hegemon, the old power, usually starts the war to block the rise of the new power. So we will promise for up to 100 years, possibly even longer. We Chinese will promise we will not disturb the old order. We will not start a war with you as long as you don't use force against us. At this point, Susan Rice, John Kerry, Vice President Biden, and even President Obama began to back away in public from the new model and say, well, this is really something we ought to explore operationally. How does it affect North Korea, for example? And by the way, who are the great powers in this new model of great power relations? Is India a member? Is Japan a member? And the Chinese answers began to sound more and more like, well, there's really only two great powers in this new order. So the Trump administration did not pursue this at all. It's still around. It was raised with the Biden administration fairly early on. So I myself sense a trap here that if you raise with the Chinese scholars, is Taiwan included in this new model that we sort of both forswear the use of force? Well, no, Taiwan is internal, Taiwan is part of China. You Americans agreed to that. And then some Americans go back to the original documents in the Nixon library, not to mention Jimmy Carter's library. We never agreed to that. We never say Taiwan is part of China, it's your sovereignty. And by the way, we have no justification to defend it. We see the Taiwan issue quite differently than the Chinese do. And that's a very big exception to the new model of great power relations. So the third debate we've gotten ourselves into now is something that Madeleine Albright first raised a long time ago in a different context, that we ought to separate out the types of issues we have between two great powers. So as I think you mentioned, Chris, Tony Blinken has done this very well. He said there's there'll be adversarial questions. My own hunch is the use of force against Taiwan would be one of those, but there could be quite a few others. Then secondly, there'll be healthy, constructive competition with China. And of course, the Chinese reciprocate that. Xi Jinping himself has mentioned several times in public that constructive competition, or sometimes he says healthy competition, is a good thing. We'll see sort of who wins, who gets the gold medal, who gets the silver medal. Well, that's very different from talking about war or the use of nuclear weapons. It's still quite positive. But yet there's a third area of issues, the cooperation issues, which they've so far spelled out: climate change, epidemiological warning. There's quite a long list of cooperative issues. And my hunch is our debate is paralyzing us, because we not only have the wonderful executive branch, the president and all of his ambassadors, we also have the wonderful congressional branch, which not only can block confirmation of ambassadors, but also has the money. It's in the Constitution. With a few exceptions, you're not supposed to spend any money unless there's been a vote of Congress, an appropriation. So many of the steps we would need to take to manage China or know what China's ambitions are involve money. And if we're telling ourselves, well, is this adversarial? Is this cooperative? Is this competitive? There's a kind of confusion going on, which is very different than saying the old Manichaean view of evil and good. And a lot of our public opinion polls, the question that's asked that sometimes gets 70% against China, the question will be close to, do you trust China? Or is China some kind of a challenge and threat? But to me, the bigger question is, do we have the capacity as a country, as a government, to manage China at all anymore? And I would argue we do not. We can do pinpricks. We can have a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics Games in February, which I think will bring back some of Chris Hill's comments in 2008. We can have what's called virtue signaling about China. We can condemn, you're committing genocide with the Uyghurs. So therefore, maybe we won't buy cotton that's produced by Uyghurs in forced labor. Even that hasn't passed, by the way. So I took a look for my next book on what are the American policy proposals, especially in front of Congress or from think tanks, about China. Do you have any idea how many there are? It's almost 1,000. And almost none of them has passed the Congress. The House Republican Task Force on China produced a long report, 400 recommendations, many of which were just asking the executive branch for reports. The US-China Commission, every year, as many as 50 recommendations, most of which are not acted on by their own account. A number of think tank proposals have come out, again, often as many as 100 ideas in the proposal, none of which is acted on. So my thesis that we have self-paralysis in Washington, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we can take stronger action. Maybe we'll get the idea of what needs to be done to manage China's ambitions. Maybe we'll develop a consensus on what China's ambitions are. But I'm quite pessimistic from what I've seen so far that, yes, we now view China quite differently than we did 7 or 8 years ago. Several Chinese articles have come out, and I'm sorry to say this, they say one book has changed American perceptions of China. You know what book it is? The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America. So they put the blame on me, an original panda hugger who supported weapons sales to China and intelligence cooperation with China. They put the blame on me and then people like me. An interesting thing is, Joe, about 30 Americans have been sanctioned now. When you get sanctioned, it means you can never travel to China for life, nor can your family, nor can your firm or think tank do any business with China. I'm still not sanctioned. And as I told you, the preface by the 2 Chinese generals said his contribution was great to US-China relations, meaning I was quite a dupe in the 70s and 80s, maybe even the 90s. But we hope he returns. I believe they have a file like this on many, many, many Americans, and they're watching the transformation as Americans, officials, retired officials, scholars shift back and forth. I think the Chinese still see America as what they call 可以拉拢过来. I can pull you over. I can pull over enough Americans. My last point really is to cite some names for you. Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, David Solomon, Tom Pritzker. There's a long list of billionaires who are quite pro-China. The other day on a Fox interview, Jamie Dimon told Maria Bartiromo, who almost fainted, we have to get used to being number 2 and China being number 1. Larry Fink has been actively for 3 years trying to get the Morgan Stanley composite index used to invest federal retirement dollars. He almost succeeded. So we have a lot of powerful Americans in and out of the Congress. Bernie Sanders has called it a dangerous bipartisan consensus that China is a threat. And Senator Sanders makes this argument in Foreign Affairs last year. So paralysis in Washington, whereas in China, the trend is really bad from our point of view. The nationalistic hawks, who the foreign ministry told us to not even talk to them, they're just irresponsible quacks. They seem to be quite influential under Xi Jinping. And this debate about our decline seems to have been resolved by the group that thinks our decline is a lot faster than most Americans think. So I hope that's enough points to get out that you can criticize me if you like, but I wish you would point out that I used to be a really good panda hugger in the old days.
Okay.
Right.
We got it on the panda hugging. Now, I know Joe and Sasha are really anxious to get in on this, but I would like to ask you, does this mean that the Chinese, I mean, from what I can understand, that the Chinese have always felt this way and that it's simply becoming clearer, and that we've had these confusing trends and sort of efforts to follow down these various rabbit holes of cooperation. But basically, the Chinese have kind of been very clear for a long time that they're not interested in some kind of convergence, to use an old US Soviet concept, and that really the decision by Xi Jinping essentially to do away with a system that was kind of working, I mean, the succession system, was not a departure point, but simply was reaffirmation of what we're dealing with, which is a very authoritarian system that, as it continues to consolidate its own issues, is now kind of coming after us. Is that fair?
No, I'm arguing that the Chinese themselves, when you interview them, obviously, especially in Mandarin, with their colleagues' books on the table, the Chinese come in at least 2 flavors. One group, you can call them sometimes Gai Ge Pai, the reformers. Yeah. They have really strong views about free market economy. Human rights ought to be much more protected. These people, for either have studied overseas or for internal reasons, they are reformers. And they were in love with Deng Xiaoping and his approach up until the Tiananmen massacre, when the other side, whatever you want to call them, they themselves call themselves patriots, or they love the party. This is one of Xi Jinping's commandments in his thought. You must love the party more than anything else. So this group, the party lovers or the hawks, they have a very different view. They know each other, and they know who gets which position or who leans in which direction. Sometimes, Chris, in speeches, they'll put in both points of view. Yeah. There's a very famous document put out by the World Bank called China 2030. It's supposed to be the blueprint for China in the future. It's a reformer document. Liu He worked on it. This group of economists, they call it the Club of 50, They worked on it. That was opposed by the other group. And we can now see Nick Lardy has a book called The Return of the State.
Yeah.
He was used to advocate and believe that China was moving toward a free market with a little bit of state-owned enterprise, but not much. The other group won. They got control of the positions. And in the speeches, they would say the market is, this is a key Chinese phrase, the market is the main force.
Yeah.
You think, well, what could be clearer than that? Free market policy. But then there'd be another sentence in the same document saying the role of the Communist Party is supreme.
Yeah, because they.
So you see this kind of compromise going on, and it's not all Chinese think one way. It's a debate that we ought to recognize from our own rather fractious and polarized politics here. We ought to be able to recognize, but we are much more open. People can say, oh, you know, he supports this and this, and that pigeonholes that person. They don't do that in China. They're much more cautious about revealing exactly who thinks what, but it's there. And right now, we're in a period where the hawks are moving ahead, it seems to me.
So can I get into this, Chris? Michael, what a great presentation and great book. If anybody knows China, Dr. Michael Pillsbury does. We go back a number of years, and I can't say enough about Michael Pillsbury. Let me just say one comment and then a question to you, Michael. I don't disagree with any of your narrative. And certainly we were there for China in the 80s, and I would say even in the 90s, in the World Trade Organization, it was the US that facilitated that entry into the world trade. We always provided the most favored nation status to China. We certainly were there with the investment, and universities were open to all the Chinese students coming. So I agree with you, and we cooperated on things like defeating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And other things. And there was a sense that China would sort of democratize, and we saw village elections, and they would blossom, and they would move into more general elections. So there was an element of disappointment that it didn't actually move in that direction. And now what we're seeing with China now is what you just described, a sense that they will overtake the United States, whether it's Graham Allison's book and whether it's Sparta and Athens or what have you, but a rising power eventually will overtake the established power. Well, having spent some time in China and looked at the issues, I don't subscribe to that at all. I see China now, and I think there are a number, and I'm sure you, and I'll ask you the question on this, Michael, 1.4 billion people, where there are a lot of domestic issues there, whether it's the disparity of wealth, whether it's the demographics, whether it's the wolf warrior mentality of being a bully to other countries that may be taking loans from you, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative and some of that turning back. We see it with the real estate aspects of the debt, significant debt. However, on the other side, we have over $600 billion in trade with China. We are linked in so many different ways economically with China. You mentioned some of the US businesses there. The investments in China continue to rise. Even in 2021, there's more investment going into China. And so there is a dynamic, and there are a lot of domestic issues that China has to address. And we see a number of irritants like Taiwan, aggression towards Taiwan and their air defense zone, whether it's the Indochina aspects of the South China Sea, freedom of navigation, whether it's certainly Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and human rights, or Hong Kong and the national security law. And we're bringing it to the fore with China. And we're saying, let's open this up. Let's open it up to the world. Let's open it up to almost 200 countries to see what system is the best, and if that's going to materialize. I submit, Michael, and I like everything you said on that. I think China has to focus so much more on its domestic issues. The Chinese Communist Party, with over 90 million members, have to focus on retaining that credibility with the public so that they can stay in power and they can get the allegiance and the loyalty and so forth. And I think some of what we saw with wolf warrior mentality and that sort of diplomacy and bullying regional neighbors and that mentality doesn't hold. So I believe that when Xi Jinping met with President Joe Biden the other week, when he talked about maybe coexisting peacefully. Maybe we could look at some of the things where we can come together, whether it's climate change, whether it's North Korea, and what have you. Now, I know these are going to be difficult moves, but I believe there are many in China who feel that you don't want to have a Cold War with the United States. You don't want to go to war with the United States. And certainly, I think Xi Jinping has to take that on. So my question to you is this, Michael. As we move forward, and the US is showing that, and other countries are subscribing to what we're saying here, is we will not just accept that sort of behavior any longer. If you want to be a legitimate nation state and a legitimate stakeholder in the international community, there are norms of behavior. And we see it in the South China Sea, whether we see it in Xinjiang and what have you on human rights. So do you think this will convince Xi Jinping, although he probably will be reelected in 2022 for another 5-year, 10-year term, maybe president for life, but do you think this will moderate the behavior in China so that they find more of a middle course, knowing that they have to address the irritants as near peer competitors, and they're going to have to behave in a different manner so that they can get their act together? Because if you lose the support of the 1.4 billion people, even though you're the Chinese Communist Party, you lose that element of legitimacy. And you know the mandate of heaven, you know Chinese history better than anyone. And when the people lose confidence in the government, and I'm not saying they lose it now, but there is a fact here that would, I think, moderate the behavior of China and get them to cooperate on things like North Korea and climate change and pandemics. Having said that, do I seem naive in believing we can move in that direction? We're not there yet. I know we're not there yet, Michael. But if we can say, why can't there be peaceful coexistence? Why can't there be elements of disagreements and debate? Wow, there is still elements of cooperation. Why can't we coexist?
Well, the simplest short answer is because of the hawks in Beijing at the top. And we know from this new defector, who would probably support everything you just said, Joe, Cai Xia, who taught at the Communist Party Central Committee Party School. She has an article in Foreign Affairs a couple of issues back. I think she's doing a book. She says that something like 90% of the Communist Party members do not like what Xi Jinping is doing. So back to the debate in Beijing, we know it goes on, but what can we do to influence it? That's where the 100-year marathon book ends, by saying, look, they can influence us beautifully. You might say exquisitely. They can read about fights inside the Biden White House on China policy in the New York Times.
But Michael, we can call them out on what they're doing in the South China Sea.
Doesn't work. No.
We could call them out in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. It doesn't work.
No. That way of thinking I used to have, but it's very naive now for either you or me to think that pinpricks, or to think that we're Gandhi in 1947, 46 in India. And that if we have a demonstration, the British have a conscience, they'll give us our independence. Yeah, that was true. But China is not India, and the British are, not in charge. The pinprick approach that we're taking is the best we can do. The Chinese believe that now. So when you say, Joe, call them out, call them out to whom? To God?
To the world.
Somehow intervene?
To all the countries in the world, Michael.
To shame Wall Street, to say to Goldman Sachs and JPMorgan, gee, you shouldn't invest in China. The whole Trump trade deal for you 6 firms to go into China, that's all canceled. We can't do that. We don't have the power, we don't have the determination, and it's not going to happen. So yes, it's nice to say that. I used to be able to say it, Joe. Yeah, we're going to call them out. What they're doing in XYZ is just a terrible thing. The Chinese laugh, the hawks laugh at us.
But countries,
if we change the balance of
I'd
power.
like to get Dr. Mansourov into this because he has some views on this. I'd like to also.
I got to read, Chris, I got to read one sentence from chapter 3. Joe Trani's in the sentence. Unfortunately, the census begins. The discovery was made by a brilliant Mandarin-speaking CIA friend, Joe Trani. The Chinese connection was a tightly held secret. No more than 10 people in the entire CIA were aware of this program. And then the cut took place. So I got to appeal this redaction, Joe, and get some more about your role.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Sasha, go for it.
Hey, thank you, Chris. And what a pleasure it is to be on the same panel with the most influential thinker in the Chinese PLA and one of the best connected American strategists in the Kremlin, Dr. Pillsbury. So welcome to the Washington Brief program. I'm really, worried about the situation which we have in the American-Chinese relationship today, the hot economics and cold politics. On the one hand, because of our concern with the genocide of Uyghurs, we announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympic Games, which is shameful. I mean, it's not even a message. I don't know how to describe it, how meaningless and powerless that action is. And on the other hand, our trade volume with China is about to hit another record, $683 billion in the first 11 months of this year. And it's on pace, to be the largest trade volume ever. Now, the US-based venture Global LNG just signed a mega deal for 20 years to supply Sinopec with 4 million tons of LNG every year. So in that situation, when the economic ties, despite the pandemic, despite the tariffs, despite the national security concerns, despite the supply chain disruptions, is still booming. Our economic trade is booming. So I'm just wondering, again, that complacency, how long is it going to last? Whether 2049 is the cutoff date, or whether we'll have some cold shower before that. I honestly, when I see this Chinese juggernaut, I am with Michael. I mean, there is very little, in my opinion, the United States can do to stop that, and we don't really have the capacity, to manage those Chinese ambitions as long as our own industrial capacity is hollowing out. I mean, the strength starts at home, and what we see is happening in the United States, unfortunately, reminds me of what happened in the former Soviet Union back in the 80s. But because we don't really have much time, I have a little question for Michael, and that relates to the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. As you know, this is the DoD effort to kind of on the military side to improve our capabilities to deal with China, to manage China. And again, it's a $5 billion effort. There are some problems with it because currently the way it's envisioned is it's all about spending on platforms like ships and aircraft. And of course, 2 U.S. Indo-Pacific commanders, they expressed very strong concerns about the spending priorities, emphasizing the need to put those $5 billion to enhance interoperability, to enhance training, to build ports infrastructure, missile defense, what have you. So my question to Michael is, what's your reading of this PDI, Pacific Deterrence Initiative? Is it really, just a Band-Aid, or is it something which can help us reposition our forces for better containing the Chinese in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, the Pacific Defense or Deterrent Initiative has a long history of at least 5 years putting together ideas, both in the executive branch and with the congressional staff. It's a very good thing. It's passed, basically, the NDAA, I think gets passed by the House today. Unfortunately, the Chinese see in it, and I'm not saying they're wrong, they see a military strategy to have a war with China, in which the Pacific Islands and the infrastructure that's to be improved in the Pacific Islands and the countries closer to China, like Malaysia, they see this as a kind of rerun of World War II, where the Japanese co-prosperity sphere forces American troops out, whatever we had, takes over the countries, including trying to take over Australia. And slowly this inter-island hopping campaign has to take place to win back what becomes the future of Asia. The Chinese view is based on very careful analysis of what both the DoD and several senators have revealed, let's say, about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And it's there. All the little runways and ports, ammunition supply depots, all the kind of arrangements that you would need to fight a World War II style 3-year war with China. Think about that, 3 years at least with China. That seems to come out of a number of war games, according to the public remarks of former Deputy Secretary of Defense and others, that if there's going to be a war with China, it's not going to be 1 week. It isn't going to be that they'll surrender as soon as a few ships are sunk. It's going to last for several years. It's hard to imagine finding a Chris Hill negotiator who would have a ceasefire. So the PDI concept is to store more munitions, to buy more cruise missiles, to perhaps deploy the new Army idea of a missile that ordinarily would violate the INF treaty, but it's the INF treaty, we withdrew from it, perhaps to be able to have this capability. So the Chinese view that we're getting ready for a 3-year war with them based on the Pacific Islands as the fallback area, and our carriers would only go in closer to China after the Chinese systems are destroyed that would menace those carriers. The Chinese see this, they write about it, they don't like it, and to them, it's the last gasp of a declining superpower. On the other hand,
of course, the real challenge is that we're observing tensions on the Russian-Ukrainian border, and there's talk in town about, a Russian effort, invasion in Ukraine or what have you. Hopefully, the summit has put it to rest those speculations. But the real issue is whether the United States can afford and can win or lose a war, a two-front war. A war against Russia over Ukraine or whatever, Belarus, the Baltics, at the same time while waging or preparing for a military effort against the Chinese. So especially at the time of the pandemic, deepening domestic economic crisis. So what's your assessment of that? Are we ready for a two-front war against two major powers, two great powers in the world?
Well, as you know, both in Moscow and Beijing, they pay a lot of attention to the formulations our Secretary of Defense makes public and the Joint Staff, JCS, makes public in their speeches. It looks like the Americans have dropped the two-front war criteria. It's now focused mainly on one main war. And the choice would be, of course, between Ukraine, with whom we have no treaty alliance, and Taiwan, with whom we have no treaty alliance. So this is difficult for our lawyers to parse. That we would
but at the same time, when we say Russia, we do not accept any red lines that you draw. China, we do not accept any spheres of influence that you think about or any red lines you draw. We're inviting a backlash from those two countries and their challenge basically to our credibility in those two regions.
I think that's right. And I have a collection of, I think it's six volumes, Columbia University Press, a series called The Road to Pearl Harbor. And it starts back in the 1920s and it goes over a 15-year period. And all the chances to step aside or not have World War II began in Pearl Harbor. All these are very carefully examined by a team of authors, both Americans and Japanese. And you just, can you get yourself into despair over all the chances there were to turn aside and all the wishful thinking. There's one section I was stunned by. Admiral Yamamoto had been to Harvard. He'd been the Navy or Defense Attaché in Washington, D.C. He's becomes chief of plans. And our ambassador writes a series of cables. I'm working with Yamamoto and the Doves, the reformers, here in Tokyo to head off the Warhawks. And Yamamoto, at the same time, the book shows, is actually drafting the plans and starting the exercises for the attack on Pearl Harbor. So knowing who is who in Tokyo in the debate of that time was impossible for us to figure out.
So, Michael, where are we going with this? I mean, we've got there is this emerging consensus. I mean, the legislature, our Congress, the administration, a kind of understanding that this issue is not going away. There's I think a tougher position, notwithstanding Dr. Mansourov pointing out the growth in our trade numbers, et cetera. But I mean, are we going to be able to cooperate with China in some way? Is there any road back? Or are we just going further and further along the Thucydides trap?
I would say there's a couple of indicators to look at. One is the size of our embassy in Beijing. It's still the largest embassy, as far as I understand it, 2,300 officials. If you look at the amount of cooperation, not just trade, but the embassy, our embassy in Beijing website mentions 50 different federal agencies that have cooperative programs with China. So we're a long way from a Cold War or some kind of crisis in US-China relations, in my view. And I was very pleased when Biden committed something which you might call mild plagiarism. He used a phrase that Trump had used many times on television. Trump would say, you know, China wants to surpass us, but it's not going to happen on my watch. Now that lays out a framework. China's not going to collapse. They have an ambition to surpass us, but I, Donald Trump, will do something to make sure it doesn't happen. That's a very controversial view, especially with the China collapse theory people who say there's no real problem with China because they will be collapsing sometime soon. That's a very strong point of view in our country, especially on Fox News, with a gentleman named Gordon Chang, who wrote a book 20 years ago called The Coming Collapse of China, which he guaranteed would happen in 2012. He then wrote in 2012, it'll take one more year. That point of view is not expressed by Joe Biden. I thought Joe Biden might say that. Instead, about 6 months ago, in an interview, Biden said, China wants to surpass us, but it's not going to happen on my watch. So that gives me the feeling that, yes, we're in a period of paralysis, as I called it now, and there is a decline in the relationship. But the way to improve it, the ways to improve it still exist and can still be brought into play. But I'm much more focused now, and I think the Pentagon certainly is, on a shooting war with China that arises out of accident or miscalculation or some kind of bluff. And all this new development that the DoD report came out just very recently, that they may go to 1,000 nuclear warheads within 5 years, greatly improving the ICBM component, which our arms controllers hate the ICBM component. A lot of our arms controllers say we need to cancel our 440 Minutemen. This is the hair trigger ICBMs, just have bombers and submarines. China seems to not agree with that and is investing heavily in this new set of ICBM fields, to the point that our strategic command, Admiral Richard, he's twice now in speeches in the past month used the phrase strategic breakout. It means nuclear strategic breakout by China is now underway. This is pretty serious.
Right.
Those are excellent points, Michael.
Yeah.
Totally agree with those.
Dr. Jenkins, as you see, we haven't solved all the world's problems in the past hour, and certainly this the challenge of dealing with China is very much in front of us. But I want to thank you and the Washington Times Foundation for making this this discussion possible, and we'll have to get back to it as well, because there's much to address. But in the meantime, I think we should all give each other Dr. Pillsbury's book again for another reading, because I think it's really one of the seminal.
Makes a great Christmas present.
There you go. There you go, Michael. Very great.
Boy,
Thank you,
very much.
Ambassador Hill.
Over to Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Ambassador Hill. As always, you do such a wonderful job at bringing out so much important information and understanding about the current challenges to the United States, and especially in Northeast Asia. Thank you, Ambassador Trani and Dr. Mansourov, and especially Dr. Michael Pillsbury. We are really honored to have you. We learned so much today, and we certainly have a lot to do to really shore up and develop our understanding of how to bring peace in Northeast Asia and around the world. We're also grateful for the Washington Times Foundation, the Universal Peace Federation, our sponsors, and particularly want to thank the Washington Times for its coverage of our Washington Brief. Thank you to our global audience. We're very appreciative of your support, and we'll see you next month in January, on January 4th. That's always on the first Tuesday of the month, the Washington Brief at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.